G'day listeners and welcome to the broadcast. So I'm Shane Broad, I'm a politician in the Tasmanian State Parliament and the budget has just been handed down. So you might not get excited about the budget. Most times when people talk about a budget, this is what you hear. And that's pretty easy to understand. What do you do when you get handed like 600 or 700 pages of multiple documents? How do you actually make sense of it? Well, in this podcast, what I'll do is I'll go through a couple of key tables just to give you a bit of an idea on where the state's headed, how to look at where the state's headed, and also a second table to see where the government are trying to fudge things. And then I'll talk a little bit about the outcome. So that's what we're going to be into today. I hope you enjoy it. So what do you do when you get 600 or 700 pages? Well, what I always do when I tear open the plastic that's the budget documents are contained in, I normally do this when the Treasurer is on his feet talking about the budget, and I go and what I do is I look at the first table, which is table 1.1, and this is called the key fiscal measures, and this basically gives you an outline of what is happening over this current budget, like the last couple of years, this current budget, and something we call the forward estimates, which is the next 3 years. So a budget cycle is typically 4 years. So this year's budget and then 3 years of estimates. And what we see is, we have a look at this table and it can tell you a fair bit about what's going on. So what do? The first thing that I look at is this, the net operating surplus for this year's budget. So for this coming financial year, the financial year we're currently in, the budget says this: the state is bringing in around $9.5 billion in revenue and we're spending $10.5 billion, which means we are $1 billion in the poo this year. So we're spending $1 billion more than what we're bringing in. But this also doesn't tell you the true picture of the budget because of accounting rules. It's actually strange, but there's some money that comes from the federal government for things like infrastructure that you can count the income and you don't have to count the spending. When you take that into account, which is this line called the fiscal surplus, which is actually the real spending, so the real income and the real spending, what you see is the state is actually going backwards this year by over $1.3 billion. Now that is a big amount of money. That's the current situation. So if the first thing that you do is you open up the budget papers and you look at this, you can see where the state's current finances are at. And this year what it's saying is the government is spending $1.3 billion more than they're bringing in. Now that means more debt. The other thing you can look at is this line of net operating surplus or deficit. And what this says is the government are pretending that everything's getting better. They are pretending that next year there's going to be less debt built up, so the next year there are going to be $800 million of extra spending on top of revenue, and then it's going to get better. And by some sort of miracle, at the end of the 4-year period, the government will actually have $5 billion of savings. So in other words, they're pretending that in 28-29, the revenue will be higher than the expenses. But just bearing in mind, the true figure is even in 4 years' time, the government will still be spending $150 million more than they are earning. And this is absolutely, the best of the best happening. And it is not true. And I'll go through why. You can see using another table this is just complete nonsense. And they're going to blow the budget like they've been doing the last few years. And you can see, you can pretend that spending's under control. You can pretend there's going to be this surplus of money in 4 years' time, but what you see is the debt over time continues to build up. So the budget for last year was that the state's debt position was going to be $5.4 billion in debt. They actually did a little bit better than that apparently. The preliminary outcome is the results from last year. That ended in, June 30, 2025, so end of June this year. It looks like they may have spent less than what they were pretending, than what they were budgeting for, and that was probably because they've underspent on their infrastructure. But what we see is this year's budget is saying we're going to be $7 billion in debt, and you fast forward to 28, 29, and we're going to be $10.4 billion in debt. So that's a massive increase. So the government are saying up here on this line, wow, things are getting better and we're headed to surplus. But the reality is, even with their little glowing rosy figures, the debt that the state is going to be accumulating is getting worse and worse and worse. So that's just the first table in the budget document and one of the most important tables. So if you look at nothing else, you look at just at this table, it'll give you a fair indication of where the state's headed, and what the situation is debt and deficit, I'm afraid. So there's a couple of graphs, charts 1 and 2. So again, these are just really early in the budget paper number 1. Sources of government revenue. So this is the $9.5 billion the state is bringing in, and the vast majority of that comes from the federal government. So a full two-thirds of the money that we're bringing in into the state, our revenue, is actually from the federal government. This means that we're very heavily reliant, especially on the GST. So if anything happens with the GST, we are in massive trouble. And our own source revenue from things like taxation is actually very, very low. If something happens for federal grants, or especially the GST, the state is in massive trouble. The next thing that we've got here is actually where the spending is occurring. And what we see, so the $10.5 billion, so that's a full $1 billion more than our income. The vast majority of that goes into health. So a third of the budget, of the entire budget, is just spent on one item, which is health. And obviously that is very, very important. And roughly a quarter is spent on education. So that's why in Tasmania, the most important budget items, the biggest budget items, are health and education, taking over half the budget, whereas half the budget is spent on everything else, from housing to other sorts of public services, environment protection, transport and so on. Health and education are absolutely the big items. So that's something that we should very, very carefully scrutinise, because that's where a lot of the spending is. So this is the second table that you should look at when you open up the budget papers. So budget paper number 1, if you look at the first table, which is table 1.1, it'll tell you where all the spending is and where the debt is, just a summary. And what this table actually tells you is how all that spending is broken down. Now, I really like looking at this table, because what this table tells you is where they're actually fudging the figures, where they're cooking the books. And I'll just go through that in some detail now. As I've said, health is a third of the budget. So it's a very, very important very, very important item. And what we see here is this is what the government were budgeting last year. So $3.1 billion was going to be spent on health, or a bit more. What was actually spent was $3.5 billion. Now, this figure might actually be a little bit worse, because apparently this document went to the printers before they had the final figures for as of June 30. This might actually be a little bit worse. But what we can see is that the government, they blew the health budget by about $400 million, so which is 12%. So in 1 year, they budgeted $3.1 billion, but the real outcome, or it might even been a little bit worse, was actually 12% difference. So they blew the budget by 12%. Now, why is that important? It's because this year the government are saying that they're going to spend $3.57 billion. So, okay, that's a little bit of an increase, not a very big increase. But then look at this. In 4 years' time, the government are pretending that they're only going to be spending $3.7 billion on health, which is a 4% increase, right? So as I've said here, there was a 12% difference in spending just in 1 year. The government are pretending in a full 4 years, the spending difference will only be 4%. Now, I can't say this harshly enough. This is absolutely not true. And this is why the budget is just pretending that things are getting better. And this is how they've cooked the books. A third of the spending in the budget on health cannot be believed. Now, why do I say that? If the government was actually going to say that in 28-29, the increase would only be 4% over a full 4 years, that would actually mean that there would be a massive, massive cut to health spending. And we know that roughly half the budget is actually wages. So that would be a hell of a lot of people on the unemployment queues if this was to be believed. I don't believe it. I think what's going to happen is they're just going to keep spending, and the debt is just going to keep getting worse. Now, what this table also shows you can have a look at some of the other items. And this sort of leads to questions in the estimates period when we sit down across the table from the minister and the departments and we can say what the hell's going on. So in this line item of economic affairs, so this year they're budgeting for $530 million, but in 4 years' time they're only going to be spending less than a half of $213 million. Now, look, there might actually be a real reason for this happening. They might actually have some sort of explanation for this, but more than likely this is just them cooking the books. And we see that also when we roll forward and we have a look at public order and safety. We see that here they budgeted for about $900 million and they actually spent $1 billion. So they're actually out by about $100 million there. And so we'll go into estimates and say, you know, what's actually happened here. Maybe there's a really good explanation, maybe there's not. But more than likely, there's definitely some questions to be answered there. And there's definitely some questions to be answered here because what they're saying is that this current financial year we're in right now, they're going to be spending less than what they ended up spending last year. And again, in 4 years' time, they're going to be spending even less again. So how the hell are they actually going to do that? Is it just pretend or do they have a good explanation? So this table starts to open up all sorts of questions that we'll be asking the government, especially during the estimates period. So that's a full week of estimates where every department, every minister gets queried for hours on end, and that's some of the times in the year when we get the best answers. We actually get real answers to questions, especially if we can badger them and then they give up and tell the truth. So what's actually happening in the state? So those two tables, the first table in budget paper number one gives you roughly where things are going. The last table that I've just shown gives you a summary of the departments and shows you where some of the fudge is happening, the fudging. And then we look at the net operating balance. So these are graphs from the budget as well, budget paper one. And we've seen this for a few years. We've seen the government saying, in effect, that things are getting worse, but look at that. Things are going to get better. So this is debt. This is how much money we are spending more than income. Also, this, if you recall, doesn't count all the spending because infrastructure doesn't have to be accounted for. But what things are happening? Things are getting worse, but look at this. Over the next 4 years, things are going to get better. This is not the first time that this has happened. So this has been going on for years. So this is last year's budget. This was the budget. That was the outcome. This is the budget year. So things were getting worse, but look at that. Things are going to get better. So that was last year. And then the year before, here we are. Things had been pretty tough for a couple of years. So some of those, to be fair, were COVID years, but the spending kept on going. So this was the budget year. And look at this. Things are getting worse, but look at that. Over the forward estimates, things are going to get better. And we're even going to have a surplus. So we should have actually had a surplus in this year's budget and then the next year's budget. That obviously didn't happen. So if we go in reverse, we can see how things have gotten worse. So this was back the 2023-24. So things are getting worse, but then they're going to get better. And then last year, well, things were getting a lot worse, but it's going to get better. And then again this year, things are getting a lot worse, but things are going to get better. You can see that these columns are just getting bigger and bigger every year, that it makes the previous years look tiny. So there we go. Things are getting worse, but things are going to get better. And that's what we've seen. Now, Saul Eslake, our eminent and independent economist, he has helpfully done up this graph, which sort of paints the picture over a longer period of time from 2010 to this year and then across the forward estimate. So this is like almost 20 years worth of data. And what we see is the net operating balance, which is the graph I just showed, and he's also got the underlying net operating balance, which is the fiscal surplus or deficit, which takes into account the true spending, including infrastructure, which is even worse. So the trend that we see over time is that the Liberals had a couple of good years here, but then the spending and the debt has been falling off a cliff. But look at that. Things are just about to get better. But the real trend is things are getting much, much worse, and I don't think these forward estimates can be believed. This is another way of doing it, which is the cash balance. So again, they had a couple of good years, but then everything is just completely falling off a cliff. What that actually means, it's all about the debt. So this is government net debt. What we see There was money in the bank, money in the bank, money in the bank until we got to about 2020. And then the spend-a-thon started and the debt, you couldn't hide the debt anymore. The debt has just been exploding. Now, the thing about this is that it's not just 1 year, right? If the debt was just here and 1 year, they had 1 year of building up debt, that would be fine. But the problem we've got is actually the trajectory of this debt. The debt is just building up and building up and building up. And even across the forward estimates, with all the glowing assumptions, the heroic assumptions of how they're going to reduce spending, we see the debt absolutely blowing out. So we've gone from no debt, so a really, really good financial position, the best financial position in the country, and now heading to this massive debt explosion. You can see this is just getting well and truly out of control. Absolutely getting out of control. And I'd just like to point out too, this is the area that highlighted is when Tasmania, Labor was actually in government in Tasmania, and we left the Liberals with zero debt, and they kept the debt off for a few years, and then they've just completely let it go. So that trajectory is just headed in completely the wrong direction. Now, this is something that a meme that I put up a couple of years ago, and it is absolutely relevant now, and that is the Liberal Party are taking Tasmania's debt to new heights. This is absolutely a massive problem for Tasmania, and it has real-world outcomes. What it actually means is Tasmania has the worst financial position of any state or territory in the country. Now, when I talk about finances, there's no doubt that people will have a crack and say, oh, but what about Labor in Victoria? They're trashing the budget and so on and so forth. Well, to all those people, I'd just like to point out that this is a graph from Saul Eslake, so an independent economist, and what he's showing is Tasmania has the worst finances in the entire country. Now, for as long as I can remember, the Northern Territory was the economic basket case, and what this graph actually shows us is from now and into the future, Tasmania has the worst finances of any state or territory, and that has happened all under this Liberal government in the last 5 years. And that's why the trajectory is just a massive problem. Where we are headed is completely into a financial toilet, and I just can't say that strongly enough. This state our budgets are being completely mismanaged. But that actually has real world impacts as well. So what we see from this graph, this is actually net interstate migration. So this is the number of people entering or leaving Tasmania. So what we see, if it's above the line, that means our population is growing and people are moving from the mainland to Tasmania, and that was certainly the case for about 10 years before this point. What we see since about March 2022, it's gone completely the other way. So the black line is the number of people that are entering or leaving the state, and what that means is that people are leaving Tasmania. So once again, we've got our best and brightest, our young people are leaving Tasmania and setting up shop on the mainland. And one of the interesting things is most of them are actually going to Victoria. Now, when I just left school, there was actually a very big downturn in Tasmania, and people were headed for mainly Queensland and Western Australia. What we see in these latest graphs is that it looks like a heap of people are moving to Victoria. Now, there's a bunch of people that are moving to Victoria. It could be young people going to uni or to further their careers. And look, we're never going to stop that, and nor should we. But our problem in Tasmania is actually getting them to come back. We want those young people to come back with their qualifications in hand, with a career that's moving, come back, help us out by setting up businesses or becoming public servants, being doctors, being nurses, starting businesses, and also starting their families. If they don't come back, what we see is our population shrinking, which is not good for the state. It means that our population is ageing, and that has real impacts on our health system and so on. So what we see is the state government, they will talk about the good parts of the budget. So one of the good things is that unemployment is really low, but I would argue that that's largely been funded by state government spending. So what happens when that state government spending stops? That will see a bit of a downturn in the Tasmanian economy, and I would expect to see unemployment unfortunately rising, which is absolutely not what we want to see. And we definitely don't want to see this number of people leaving the state. This has been a pretty consistent trend and is absolutely heading in the wrong direction. So what does all this mean? So as I've pointed out, you can take the 700 or odd pages of a budget, and if you have a look at a couple of tables, you can get a bit of an idea of where the state's headed. And where the state's headed, unfortunately, is debts and deficits as far as the eye can see. We've got a government who are pretending everything's getting better, but the figures don't lie. The debt is building up, and I think that the government spending just cannot be believed. We also have to remember as well, in the budget, there is the public servants are currently going through strike action and so on. The budget says that public servants in Tasmania will get a 2.5% pay rise. That's what the budget figures are based on. We know that the government have already offered 3%. Half the budget is wages, so that's actually a big difference to the budget, so it blows things further. But what we know is that's not realistic, and public servants will no doubt be arguing for much higher pay rises than the 3% that's currently on the table. So I think that the current budget just can't be believed, especially the spending. What we see is debt continuing to build up and the state heading in the wrong direction, and unfortunately people starting to leave the state. This is where we're at. So we've got ahead of us for the next few weeks. So next week we'll have a budget reply, and that's when Labor will get our chance to put our point out the issues with the budget and also talk about some of the areas we think the government can improve. And then from then we go to estimates, which we basically pull apart the budget and we try and find out the truth of the budget situation, uncover all the stuff hidden under hollow logs and so on. So that's where we'll be headed for the next couple of weeks. Very, very exciting time. Yay for politicians. For most people, it's pretty boring. But look, if you really like this sort of content, I'd ask you to like and subscribe to the broadcast. Also, if you've got questions, then just put them in the comments. I'm more than happy to have a go at responding. Spread this widely. Anyway, that's me for this time round. So thanks for listening to the broadcast. Until next time, see you later.